مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. خصوم أمريكا في الشرق الأوسط وخاصة سوريا وإيران لم يرحبوا ترحيبا حارا بجون بولتون ومايك بومبيو. فقبل يوم واحد فقط من دخول بولتون إلى البيت الأبيض مستشارا للأمن القومي، وقبل 5 أيام من شهادة بومبيو أمام مجلس الشيوخ التي ساهمت ترشيحه وزيرا للخارجية، شنت سوريا هجوما مروعا بالأسلحة الكيماوية ضد المدنيين الإبرياء في منطقة ريف دمشق. وعلى الفور تقريبا هاجم الرئيس ترامب على تويتر مسميا رئيس سوريا الأسد الحيوان، ومنتقدا بالاسم الرئيس الروسي بوتين لقيامه بحمايته، وهدد كذلك بالرد عسكري عنيف. سوريا ما هي إلا واحدة من قضايا السياسية الخارجية الكبرى العديدة التي ورثها فريق ترامب الجديد للأمن القومي، بما سينسخ الرئيس بشأن اتفاق إيران النووي، بما سينسخ الرئيس بشأن النزاع بين خلفاء في الخليج، وبما سينسخ الرئيس بشأن الوعود بإيجاد خطة للسلام بين العرب وإسرائيل، وبما سينسخ الرئيس بشأن الحرب التجارية المتسائدة مع الصين، وبما سينسخ الرئيس بشأن مواجهة الجهود الروسية الرامية للتلاعب بانتخاباتنا. لمناقشة أجندة فريق الرئيس ترامب الجديد للأمن القومي، يسرني أن أرحب بلجنتنا التي تضم خبيري السياسة الخارجية دينيس روس وستيف كليمنز. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. I'm sitting here with our panel of foreign policy experts to talk about a new foreign policy day here in Washington with a new national security team and new challenges facing the administration. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Good to be with you.
So let's start with some new challenges. Syria. President Assad has used chemicals on civilians before. What is new, or what makes this a new opportunity, a new challenge for President Trump? Dennis?
You know, it's interesting, you're right. Not only has he used them before, but there's probably been, a conservative guess is, at least 20 chlorine attacks since a year ago when the United States basically launched a one-off punishing or retaliatory attack for the previous use of gas. So why now? I think it boils down to the pictures. You know, the imagery seems to affect this president. It affected him a year ago, last May, and I think it affects him now, that this seemed to cross a line again because the imagery, the pictures with people foaming at the mouth and the testimonies to that. And I think there's one other factor. It seemed gratuitous. They were about to succeed in reclaiming all of eastern Ghouta and Duma, and yet here is the use of chemical weapons at a time when you know, it seems, I mean, to say it's ever necessary, it's never necessary, but it almost seemed as if it was in your face and gratuitous. My own sense is the president the week before had said we're getting out of Syria, and this was a perfect opportunity for Assad to send the signal, I can do whatever I want and no one is going to limit what I do. Here are terror weapons and no one can stand up to it. I think that helped to explain the timing, but I think also maybe because the president had said what he said the week before, maybe that also contributed to his feeling that he needs to do something.
Steve, why do you think the president responded so violently, as it were, in the face of the pictures that came out of Syria?
Well, I agree with Dennis that and it's disconcerting actually that the president moves when he's given visual evidence, given photos of children dying, because there ought to be a lot of other standards for a president making a decision and going forward. But we know from members of his National Security Council team that when they want to move him, they make picture books as opposing to delivering data and detail and simulations and scenarios that for him are quite boring. So the pictures moved him, but I think I agree with everything that Dennis just said. There are a couple of other dimensions here. The first strike that he took, the one-off that you mentioned, was a very polite strike. You know, very little damage. The runway was running within hours. The Russians were tipped off that we were going, very little loss of life. It was a polite strike. In my book, it wasn't meaningful. This seemed to reach a higher decibel level, and there's a big difference in what we had now is that the president, even shortly after that earlier strike, was palling around with Vladimir Putin, calling, there was no tension at all that was obvious in the U.S.-Russia relationship. That's different now because not only is this Assad, but the complicity of the Russians seems quite clear, that they must know, given their deep involvement now in all things Syria, that they are protecting, that they know and are aware of the various chemical agents that Syria is still stockpiling and still holding to use in these cases. They were responsible after John Kerry made the idea of Syria getting rid of and abandoning all of its chemical weapons. The Russians were the agent who did that, so they have failed. So that has added a dimension to this, which is dangerous but important. And in that tweet that Donald Trump said, it was really remarkable that for the first time he attacked Vladimir Putin.
Right, and so actually you referred to chlorine. There's some evidence that there's sarin mixed with chlorine, and that of course would take this to a totally higher level.
Right.
I thought that Assad gave up all of his sarin gas under this deal 3 years ago.
Well, the answer obviously, he did not. I think most people at the time thought that most of it was out, but not all of it was out, and he's demonstrated since that time that he decided there was a threshold where he wouldn't use sarin gas, he would use the chlorine. And when the chlorine drew no response, it was safe from his standpoint to use it. Again, I think the statement of the president that we're getting out of Syria sent him a message that, okay, I don't have to worry about the Americans because they're getting out, and I have my own interests. I have about 20,000 deployable forces. I have to move them around. I want to end this now. I want to show that I can't be resisted. So this is a good way to demonstrate that. And I think Steve's point's an important one. Almost impossible for him to be doing this without the Russians at least being aware. I'm not saying the Russians said, okay, go ahead and do it, but it strains the bounds of the imagination and credulity to think that somehow the Russians are completely unaware when he does something like this.
So, Steve, let me ask you about the politics of this for a moment. 1 week, as Dennis points out, President Trump says, we're pulling out of Syria. The next week, he sees these pictures, we're going to bomb them, use our best missiles, we're going to punish them. How does that
It means there are two realities coexisting. One is Donald Trump is emotional. He can be drawn into emotional engagements, as we've seen with Kim Jong-un and Rocket Man, and going back and forth. He personalizes these tensions in a certain way. But in his deep core, I believe, he is less interventionist than any president we've seen in a very long time. And there was a lot of criticism of President Obama for being strategically cautious just about everywhere and wanting so many stars to align before the United States took action. In my book, Donald Trump is far more profoundly uninterested in throwing forces around the world or international engagement. He may pretend and posture differently, but he is much, much more careful and cautious than Obama, certainly more than Hillary Clinton, George W. Bush, and any of the predecessors that I can think of that have either challenged for the White House or been in the White House.
So, Dennis, this is the perfect setup for me to ask you about the president's new national security team, replacing at the White House John Bolton for H.R. McMaster as National Security Advisor, and at the State Department, Mike Pompeo for Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. Both Bolton and Pompeo at least have reputations for a greater willingness to use military force to address international problems. How do you think their arrival on the scene is going to affect, first, the Syria question, but more generally, the decision-making on the balance and the use of force in international affairs?
You know, I think Steve put his finger on something. America First, which is the slogan that this president ran on, it has its antecedents back in the 1930s. And it didn't mean that the U.S. was isolationist in the sense that it would never do anything on the outside. It just meant that we would pursue our interests basically irrespective of anybody else. Alliances were in fact a drag on us because they might obligate us. We didn't want to have to intervene anywhere except under circumstances where the threat was unmistakable and could be defined in a way that was acute for us. Now, I think this president, in fact, is not an interventionist. I've written that I think that he's the anti-Obama on every issue except Syria. If you look at his policy on Iran, it's tough rhetorically, unlike President Obama's, but the practical manifestations of it are not. Now, the question you ask is a really interesting one, because Bolton and Pompeo, by definition, are much more, in terms of everything they've said and done, they're much more interventionists. Although Pompeo, in his confirmation testimony before the Senate, was trying to suggest, he shouldn't be portrayed as a hawk, that he thinks that when it comes to the Iran nuclear deal, we ought to fix it.
We'll get to that in a moment.
Right. But I'm just saying that these are manifestations of someone who's trying to soften the edges of his appearance. Bolton, is pretty quiet right now, so we don't know. But I do think there's a potential tension there between who they are, what they think America's role in the world is, how they think it can be fulfilled through the use of coercion. Coercion doesn't always mean force, but it means you're wielding the threat of force to back your diplomacy. That may fit, the idea of threatening but not using force may fit Donald Trump. I've often felt when I looked at the two of them as well, the timing of these appointments, President Trump is someone who wants to create the image that he's going to do all sorts of things. Well, having them there around him as he goes to negotiate with Kim Jong-un might be highly useful from his standpoint to send the message, gee, look who I have behind me.
So Steve, is the appointment of Bolton and Pompeo theater, or is it for real?
I think it's theater for exactly the reasons Dennis said, because there's this deep tension between what we know about John Bolton is that he tilts towards preemptive strikes, he tilts towards deployment of military force very, very easily. We see that in his writing. John Bolton has been very consistent for a very long time. Anyone hiring John Bolton knows what they're getting. And John Bolton also is known to have been someone who cherry-picked intelligence, who starts out with a bias, who brings people into the room who share that bias and who squeeze people out of the room who don't share that bias. But that doesn't mean he's making the decisions for the President of the United States. I think the President is using, in a kind of good cop, bad cop way, which we'll have to explain to our listeners, but a potential way to look that he's got diversity on his team, that he's got Jim Mattis out as Secretary of Defense, who's right now looking like the adult, the mature, the sober, the careful, and he's got a couple of guys who are a bit more crazy and trigger happy. So that gives Trump more maneuvering room. And so I do think and believe that from what we've seen, Donald Trump is much better at theater than many of us give him credit for. And I don't think that hiring John Bolton means that Donald Trump is going to begin going to war in lots of places in the world.
Well, that may be the case. Both Pompeo and Bolton are mature adults. They're not going to stick around for very long if they think that they are merely pawns on
Not
stage.
many people are sticking around very long.
Okay, so this is the Syria conundrum. We're going to move after the break to ask what impact this new team has on other issues on the president's foreign policy agenda, from the question of the Iran nuclear deal to the growing trade conflict with China, in just a moment. Our guests today include Steve Clemons. Steve is Washington editor-at-large for one of America's premier news, opinion, and literary magazines, The Atlantic. To his right is Dennis Ross. Dennis is my colleague and counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. All right, gentlemen, let's open the aperture a bit, because it's not going to be very long before President Trump has a major decision to make on whether the United States should stay in the Iran nuclear deal. Dennis, where do you think the president is, and what impact, if any, again, does the arrival of Messrs. Bolton and Pompeo have on this decision?
There's a conventional wisdom here in Washington that the president will withdraw from the deal on May 12th. because he said it's the worst deal ever negotiated, because he now has both Bolton and Pompeo, who were very strong critics of the deal. In a sense, it looks like the stars are aligning in such a way that reflect both his personal instincts and the people around him, that makes it likely for him to withdraw. I have to say, as you know, I'm not always a keen embracer of the conventional wisdoms. I think it could be right, but I'm not convinced yet, because I also think they can go to him, especially Pompeo, can go to him and say, look, you know, we got the Europeans to change because of you. The Europeans are negotiating with the administration on a number of the concerns that the president outlined when he explained that he wasn't going to renew the extension of waivers on sanctions again unless something was done to the deal itself or something was done to address the concerns. So what were the concerns? The sunset provisions, meaning when do key limitations on the Iranian nuclear program lapse? Here, I think the Europeans, this will be the hardest issue. The Europeans, I think, will probably be prepared to make a statement that talks about expectations after 2030, but not necessarily say something that would be viewed as contradicting the deal itself. But they're very clearly ready to do sanctions on ballistic missile testing. They are very clearly prepared to adopt tougher positions against the Iranians in the region, and they're probably prepared to make a statement on inspections, even though they see that, according to the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, we have the right to challenge inspections at declared or undeclared sites, but we have to take our suspicions to the Joint Commission before we can do that. There's a 24-day period where, one way or the other, if it doesn't get resolved, the Iranians, if they don't allow access to any facility that we have these suspicions, would be in breach of the violation, even if it's a military facility. Now, the Europeans could easily say, this is something that applies to all sites, including military sites. So they're clearly ready to respond to some of the concerns. And in the case of Pompeo, who's going to be Secretary of State, you can ask the question, does he really want to start his tenure with a basic breach between the United States and its core European allies? And that's why I don't think it's a given that he's going to withdraw. It may still be more likely than not, but I don't think it's a given.
Steve, what's your hunch?
Well, I think the world and American prestige would be in a much better place if Dennis's scenario works out. I have my doubts because it's such a special choreographed, nuanced approach that this administration. I mean, I think that not just Pompeo, but John Bolton, I have a hard time seeing would have taken this job if he didn't have a very good indication from the president that he was going to decertify the deal and back out. The question is what happens the day after. My sense is the United States is in a very awkward position at that point because the Europeans are not going to drop and walk away. It will look like the United States was the rogue in this situation, not the Iranians, not anyone else. And we saw an interesting tension with the one point where Dennis may have something that I haven't thought through as I watched very carefully the Pompeo hearings and the exchange with the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Menendez, who asked if we did walk away, are we going to snap back sanctions on Iran? Which would be very interesting. Iran, which according to everyone has not yet misbehaved or violated the agreement, that sanctions would bounce back possibly, but Pompeo did not jump on that, did not bite on that, which tells me that maybe Dennis has something right, that the administration has not yet gotten to that point where it wants to take an extremely tough hand on Iran, that it's keeping that door open. And that was unexpected.
This is a bit of uncertainty about the Iran deal, interestingly. Let me ask you about another major question, pushback against Russia. A lot of internal debate in the administration, Russian meddling in our election, Russian nefarious behavior, Eastern Europe, Ukraine, what they're doing in Syria. Is this administration with Messrs. Bolton and Pompeo going to get tougher against the Russians? Steve, what do you think?
I think this administration will get tougher against the Russians, is getting tougher against the Russians. I was in Davos and went to one of the wild parties.
You're showing off, Steve.
I am. This is a humble brag, but I had to go for my work. It was forced on me, but I went to the Oleg Deripaska party where there were buckets of caviar and many magnums of Dom Perignon champagne and lots of, Enrique Iglesias. It was remarkable to see an oligarch in his environment. we are shutting Oleg Deripaska down, someone who's very close to Vladimir Putin and many other people. That doesn't mean the President of the United States is aligned with his own administration. This is one of the real conundrums right now as we look at this White House, is that Donald Trump himself gives Vladimir Putin much more leeway, much more benefit of the doubt than anyone else, both Republican or Democrat, wants to give. And it's very clear from Pompeo's, again, testimony that he has a hard line on Russia. And John Bolton generally has a hard line on Russia. So when you look at the new cast of characters, these are not weak-kneed folks when it comes to dealing with Russia. It is Donald Trump himself that is out of alignment, but Donald Trump may not define his administration when it comes to this. I think they'll be very tough.
And where do you think, if they do get tougher on Russia, how will this manifest itself?
It's an interesting question, because here it comes, I think, face to face with the non-interventionist instinct of the president. Whatever his reasons for always wanting to give Putin the benefit of the doubt, the fact is he also has a non-interventionist instinct, and he's not keen on confrontation. And I don't think, by the way, any of the certainly Mattis is not keen on confrontation. We have his own testimony on the Hill in which he's describing, one has to be very careful how one launches military strikes against Syria precisely because the Russians are there. So how does it manifest itself? I think it manifests itself in terms of a greater readiness to do more sanctions against the Russians, one. I think it manifests itself in terms of absolutely no give on the question of Ukraine and Crimea. It could manifest itself in terms of we've provided some lethal assistance to the Ukrainians. I could see us actually providing more as a way of trying to build leverage on the Russians. If there really was a policy designed to raise the cost to the Russians, not as an end itself. That's the point. When you do diplomacy, if it isn't backed by what can be threats and inducements, is oftentimes, especially with adversaries, not very likely to work. And one thing we know with Putin, he's not bluffed. Words don't matter to him, but actions do matter to him.
Let's open the aperture even a bit more, because all of this is occurring at a moment of amazing roller coaster ups and downs in our economy because of this fear of a trade war with China, a party that is essential to another national security challenge we have, the talks with North Korea. Now, I know this sounds all very complicated, but when you think all this is going to happen in just the next few weeks, literally just the next few weeks, where do you think the president is heading on? Does he expand the trade war with China? Does he contract it as he approaches these North Korean negotiations? Steve, why don't you begin?
This is a really, really tough one to call. My sense is that when I look at these trade issues, and I used to work on trade and economic issues in the 1990s.
And we have 1 minute to go.
With Clyde Preston. Yeah, 1 minute to go. Well, I think he's going to do what he did in the first time around with Syria. He's going to create a way to have a polite strike. He's going to figure out a way to impose sanctions, but they're going to be limited across certain limited sectors, and U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer is going to find a way to narrow the aperture, and the Chinese are going to accept that and respond in kind and ratchet down the decibel level of what they promised to do, particularly on pork in Iowa, which is very politically volatile, and find a way to kind of diminish those tensions as we go in. That's what I think will happen.
So you think it'll end up shrinking the conflict?
Well, I do, and I also think it's really wild and interesting that the president, after walking away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is now talking about going back in.
All right, gentlemen. Well, Syria, Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, all in the next few weeks, we will have clarity on the impact of Messrs. Pompeo and Bolton. Thank you very much for joining us this month on Dakhel, Washington.
Thank you.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول تغييرات في القيادات في البيت الأبيض ووزارة الخارجية، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.